As I've been talking to clients about budgeting, and in particular early stage budgeting, there's a lot of it that makes some intuitive sense, and then there's other aspects that I've been finding different ways of discussing with people, because I think there are some aspects to it that are a little bit more of an art than a science. And as I've been talking to more and more people about this, I wanted to just get some of these thoughts down in a video for you, and also tie it to some of the support material that I offer people, which, regardless of if you're a client of mine or not and have access to that, it's a sort of general way of thinking about developing and budgeting for commercial projects, especially at the beginning. And so looking at the list of support material that I provide people, this sort of early phase but high value planning, I keep talking about that because so much of the stuff that you do in this initial window is going to dictate the big picture items of your project. And part of that has to do with budgeting, setting up your business model, and part of that, or a big part of that really, has to do with how much space is needed for these things. How much space can you afford? How much can you spend on the build out? And so what I give to people are a very, very stripped down budgeting worksheet. And this is really simple. All it is using the size of your project, which is in this first purple cell, the cost per square foot of the project, and then multiplying that by 1, or maybe we take a lower number, so we reduce that by a certain percentage, or maybe we add another 25% to that to try to start establishing a budget window. And then on top of that, we can add things like specialty contractors or furnitures, fixtures and equipment, other carrying costs, whatever it is. The whole point is to try to just help you understand how there's a lot of things that just add up. And that's why when we say a building budget, $100 a square foot is almost nothing these days, but just using that for nice round numbers. The reason is because there's always so much that goes into every aspect of this, whether it's the carrying costs and general conditions from the contractor. It's not just about saying, well, the elevator is $50,000. It's all of the other stuff around that too. And that's why when we have these historic numbers, which are dollars per square foot, generally at the beginning of projects, that's coming from a sort of encapsulation of the whole process. It's not just adding up a couple of line items. It's actually taking into account a much larger set of items, which when we really start to look at a more detailed budget starts to show up. So if we flip over here to a more detailed budget, what we can start seeing is that we break things out into divisions, division 1 through 18. There's actually more, but the point is that each division, so in this case division 1, encompasses and encapsulates a variety of different things. As you start moving down and you start getting into finishes, you start to also realize that there's a whole bunch of other things that are included, and that at the very top, you also have, general conditions for the contractor, project supervision, temporary facilities, et cetera, et cetera. All of this rolls up into the summary, and then on top of that, you have the contractor's overhead and profit, insurance, et cetera, et cetera. So you're going to be under budgeting yourself if you don't use information that actually covers most of that. And that's why in the more basic budgeting worksheet, we simplify it, but we can assign certain numbers when we say, well, that's about $100 a square foot or whatever it is. And how do we know that? Well, budgeting books and cost books, as we call them, are issued every year. And they talk about different types of facilities. So are you a hospital? Are you a school? Whatever the case is, we can start to have an understanding regionally, and then also by type of project and by year of project, what the cost will generally be for these different things. And so when we're looking at a project, we don't have much information. We might only have a concept drawing or a schematic drawing. That basically is just square footages, and maybe we know the difference between this is locker room, which is more expensive than the open gym space, et cetera, et cetera. So we can start to carve things up a little bit, but in general, we're looking at a pretty high level because we don't have fixtures, we don't have finishes picked out, and there's still a lot to figure out. And so when we look at a budget, one of the things that I talk about is we can start sort of bottom up, meaning we can add it all together. And so if you were a client and you told me, I want 2,000 square feet of this, plus this, plus this, plus this, that's sort of your wish list, and we can add all that up. And we know generally, using historic numbers, which are generally, I mean, they're historic because they often end up being within, say, 5 to 10% of the final budget. So they're pretty accurate. We can add it all up and tell you generally what that would cost. The other way to look at this would be to say, I have a certain budget. What can we do for that? And so if you tell me a budget, we can then divide it by, say, the size of your facility to know how much money per square foot you've got available, which in itself should set an expectation for what you're purchasing. So if you told me, I want a fitness facility that looks like whatever one down the street, a super nice one, I can generally tell you how much that would cost per square foot. If you're telling me you have a very limited budget, then I can sort of reverse engineer that and say, well, you know, it's going to be hard to get X, Y, or Z because it's just about lining up expectations and budget. And so at the beginning, what you're really trying to do is make sure that your business model and your budgeting aren't way off so that someone who knows what they're looking at doesn't look at it and just go, you know, that just doesn't line up. And so if you are looking to adjust your budget, a few big chunks you can look at. Number one, what are you being delivered? What is the landlord work? Are you installing air conditioning systems? Are you installing elevators? What are you doing as the tenant versus what are you being delivered from the landlord? Because those can be six-figure items that will very quickly either add or take away from your budget. You might end up still having to pay for that in your lease and your rent, but if your concern is money up front, that might be a way to sort of push some of that onto different sides of the tenant and the landlord ledger. Another way to make a project less expensive very quickly is to make it smaller. Sometimes it's hard to just make a project physically smaller. Sometimes you can remove things like a second floor or a mezzanine or a part of a mezzanine. But if you're looking to remove 20, 25% of a budget, whatever it is, you may have to really decide, am I willing to make it smaller or am I not willing to do the project? And so sometimes these decisions come down to that. And the reason is because the final sort of real budget adjustment would be having to do with all of the selections you make. And even though things like tile or appliances, they might be 10 times more expensive as something comparable, but you know, a lot cheaper, that stuff is not, those aren't the biggest bites of a project. They're not the bones of the project where you're buying these very expensive chunks of a building. Those are still the finishes of a building. And so even though they might add up to be significant money, very often they're not responsible for big chunks of the percentage of your building. And so those are often for more dialing in the final budget because, you know, the who's doing what work and then how much of the work are you doing, meaning the size. Those are sort of the biggest chunks, and then you kind of adjust it from there. And so, you know, again, depending on if you are adding it up, I want X, Y, and Z, that equals this budget, versus my expectation is a facility that looks like this, we can tell you what that budget would be. A lot of times we look at it from both ends, meaning, you know, how much does this generally cost versus what does it sort of all add up to? You can kind of work at it from both directions. And so in a budgeting worksheet like this, you know, you've got two inputs as a starting point. Project size, project cost per square foot. This results in numbers that are just simply multiplying those. So you know if you reduce the size or you reduce the dollar per square foot, the total cost changing. And so you can sort of go back and forth with this because again, it's really more of an art than a science. But I just wanted to cover a few different ways that I think about projects and how to adjust budgets, and then how to look at budgets when we don't have a lot of information but still really need to have some numbers that can start to establish the playing field that we're on. So hopefully that's helpful, and I'll talk to you the next time. Thanks.